Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to very much welcome everyone today to our second webinar, or second episode in our webinar series on how to grow top soils. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we are gathered today and pay their respects to their elders past and present and emerging. My name is Matthew Warnkin. I'm the Managing Director of AgriProve. AgriProve is a soil carbon project developer that basically enables landholder participation in carbon and other environmental markets, enabling farmers to access additional revenues. We're hosting this 7th webinar series. I'm very fortunate to have Declan McDonald, who's Principal Soil Scientist with Regen Soils, here as the presenter to help unpack that journey on how to actually improve soil health and how to grow soil carbon. Declan's a certified professional scientist. There's a wealth of experience in soil, in agriculture, and a variety of roles from both the public and private sector. And so is very well placed to provide those unique insights into growing soil carbon and the science behind how to grow soil carbon. The first webinar was on how soil works and how plants grow. And my key takeaway from that episode was that the shift that occurred in agricultural practices post-Second World War as part of that Green Revolution, and that shift was away from feeding, was a shift towards feeding the plant and not necessarily feeding the soil. And the results of losing phosphorus solubilizers, nitrogen fixers, the removal of deep roots, the tillage and that soil disturbance. And a key one for me was that loss in biodiversity. I think Declan quoted this, a figure of 80,000 arthropods down to 6,000 arthropods per square meter. To end up in this sort of situation where we've got agricultural systems that are dependent on external inputs and landscapes that have lost literally millions of tons of soil carbon. So our challenge, which is also our opportunity, is to reverse this trend with a focus on agricultural practices that grow soil carbon, but do so with a real commercial focus on reducing costs, increasing profits, and essentially deploying a risk management or a strategy, an adaptation strategy to a changing climate. Today's webinar is on organic matter, the cornerstone of soil health and sustainable production. Before we get started, just a quick housekeeping points. We are recording the webinar, so each module will be available on our website, so you can catch up if you do miss a session, that 7-part series. We'll be running for about an hour. Declan will be speaking for around about 45 minutes, and we will have question time at the end. Today's session is also being streamed on YouTube Live. Now, there is a chat pane on YouTube Live for questions and comments. If you're attending via the Zoom webinar, we do have that Q&A for questions, and you're very much welcome to ask those questions throughout the webinar and to use the chat function if you've got any other comments. And just on the Zoom part, you can send a message to everyone or to just the host and the panelists. So once again, very fortunate, very happy to have Declan here as our presenter, and like to welcome Declan onto webinar series and episode number 2. Over to you, Declan.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks for that introduction. Now I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully you can all see my opening slide. Organic matter, the cornerstone of soil health. Can you see that? I trust you can. Okay, so this is the second in the series of 7 webinars. What I wanted to do was start off simply last week talking about how soil works, and Matthew paraphrased that really well. Today, we need to get stuck into organic matter because it really is the cornerstone of soil health. So we need to understand organic matter and its role in agroecology, in systems management, because it really does underpin the resilience and strength and productivity of our soils. Next week, we're going to be talking about soil biology in some detail. The week after, mineral management. The week after, managing fertility to build soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. Then we'll talk about management practices to grow carbon. And we're going to wrap it up on week 7 to talk about monitoring and evaluation. So how do you know that you're making progress? So let me get on with it. We've got a bit to cover today, so I'm going to go through some of these things, hopefully not too quickly, but quickly enough. So I'm going to start off. What is soil organic carbon? Well, it is a fixed component of soil organic matter, and I use the terms interchangeably, although strictly speaking, I shouldn't. Soil organic carbon is pretty much a consistent 58% of soil organic matter. Total soil carbon, I should just make the point, includes inorganic carbon. So inorganic carbon is carbonates. Some soils have high levels of carbonates, other soils have got almost none. But just understand that there's a difference between total organic carbon and total soil carbon. Soil organic matter is made up of anything that is living or was once living. In addition to organic carbon, soil organic matter contains a range of essential macro and micro elements. And because of that, soil organic matter is the primary energy source in the soil. And just to illustrate that point, you can see here, this is some basic analysis of humans, bacteria, fungi, crop stubble, humus, and what's called light fraction. I'll talk about that, a form of organic matter as we go through. And you'll see that the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur proportions are fixed in all of these different organisms. But the real point I want to make here is to show that there are substantial components of macro elements and microelements not shown in organic matter. And that is what drives production. That's where so much energy is coming from.
Excuse me, Declan, just the presentation, you're actually through as presenter view. I wonder if you might be able to just toggle that onto just seeing the main slide.
I know what you mean. Yes, I can do that.
Thanks.
I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again. Yes, okay, I think that will sort us out.
Yeah, that's great, and sorry to interrupt your flow.
No, that's fine, so that looks better. Thank you for that. Okay, so soil carbon is so important as a component of soil organic matter because it really controls these 3 key functions in soil physics, chemistry, and biology. We often talk about this being the stool with 3 legs, and the organic matter is the seat, and it's connected by each of these 3 legs. And these 3 legs have to be functioning optimally for that stool to be robust, resilient, and to bear the weight of production demands that we put on it. Now, since the Green Revolution, we've had an overly strong emphasis on the chemical side of production, followed by the physical, and lastly, by biological. So we're beginning to bring the biological function back into the frame because we have really suffered the loss of it. Okay, so important for profitability and important for long-term viability. I've kind of covered off on those points. Okay, so I shared this slide, I think, last week, and really this is just reminding us again that we have lost so much carbon with clearing the land and with cultivating the land and the kind of farming that we have used, whether it's been tillage or whether it's been grazing. And so many of our landscapes have been grazed in a way that worked in cool, wet, northern climates, but absolutely do not work in warm, dry Australian climates. And we really need a completely different model of grazing, in my opinion, to sustain grazing landscapes and to return much of this lost soil carbon to the system. So we want soil carbon, and we want a lot of it. As I said, it's the primary energy source in soil, so it's food for soil microbes. It holds water. It's a really significant element in the soil, and as I'm showing there, relatively small increases in soil organic carbon and organic matter, massively increases the amount of water that's held in a hectare of fertile soil. Organic matter has a huge role to play in nutrient holding capacity. So we'll talk later about cation exchange capacity, which is a measure of the soil's ability to hold nutrients. So for example, a sandy soil might have a cation exchange capacity of 5, a clay soil might have a cation exchange capacity of 25, but organic matter might have a cation exchange capacity of 300, 400. So you can see in this way, it punches enormously above its weight in terms of its nutrient holding capacity. It has a huge role to play in soil structure, in the way that the soil is organized and in the way that the soil organisms organize the soil for their benefit. So there's big relationships between structure and yield, which I'll talk about. Soils are softer when they're well structured. Compaction and structure work. They're opposite ends of the scale. Compaction is major damage to soil structure, and of course. We need soil structure for rapid infiltration of water and exchange of gases between the soil and the atmosphere. And we'll talk about organic amendments as we go through too, because they're not all created equal. So how do we get it? Well, we can grow it, crop roots and stubbles, intercropping, ground cover. The most important thing really is keeping the soil covered at all times. And zero till is a mechanism that recognizes that in a cropping situation where it is harder to maintain ground cover year round. We can buy it in the form of animal manures and composts. And obstacles to sequestering higher levels of soil carbon is really about imbalances in the soil's demand for organic matter. So we have to look after the critical balance of soil carbon in, soil carbon out, and things like overgrazing and burning are ways that we lose large volumes of soil organic matter really very quickly. There's issues about cost handling and transport to bring in carbon if we're going to import animal manures and composts. And then there's issues about the quality of the material that we're bringing in. Is all organic matter equal? And how do we figure that out? So we'll cover some of these points as we're going through. So our traditional understanding of sequestering soil organic matter has always been just grow bigger crops. And as you can see, big roots means a lot of organic matter going into the soil. Now, the conventional wisdom has always been we grow bulk organic matter for the soil by growing big crops. So we put lots of fertilizer on to grow big crops. But we're learning now that is not working. And we know it's not working because we've gone out onto landscapes where there's been high levels of fertility, where high levels of fertilizer have been applied over years, and that is not always returning high levels of soil organic matter. What we're understanding more and more is the role of soil microbial biomass and their contribution to the soil carbon pool. And relatively new research is showing we're able to discriminate now, thanks to some sophisticated tools, the origins of soil carbon. And we're learning that microbial detritus is contributing really significant quantities to the total soil organic carbon pool, far more than was ever previously appreciated. Now, this has got really critical consequences for the way that we farm, because we have ignored the biological dimension so much over the last 60 plus years. If that's where most of our sequestered organic carbon is coming from, well, it's no surprise that we have depleted organic matter and that we're having difficulty reinstating some of those previous levels of organic matter. So we have a huge dependency on microbes to sequester that organic matter. And there's more and more evidence coming through of the effectiveness of high biological populations and soil carbon sequestration. And in fact, a very good example is one of Matthew's clients, Niels Olsen in South Gippsland, who received the first carbon credits for carbon sequestration. And I suspect that a significant contribution to that elevated carbon came from microbes on Niels's farm. Now, before we go too much further, I just want to cover off on some terminology. I've talked about soil carbon being a component of soil organic matter. When we talk about soil carbon sequestration, I'm sure most of you understand this, but I'm just covering off that it implies a measure of permanence. So we're taking carbon from the atmosphere and we're putting it in the soil, and we want it to stay in the soil because we want to increase soil organic matter. We want to restore those lost quantities of soil organic matter. The Carbon Farming Initiative is the mechanism through which farmers get paid for carbon. I'm not going to talk about that. Matthew is the expert on that. But I will talk about carbon pools. And what we talk about here with carbon pools is the fact that carbon exists in different forms in the soil. So labile, the three principal pools that we talk about are labile, humus, and recalcitrant. And as you can see there, there's a few other names just to add to the confusion, where sometimes labile carbon is referred to as particulate carbon or the light fraction of carbon. Humus is often referred to as the slow pool of carbon, and recalcitrant carbon has been referred to as inert carbon or resistant carbon. We know now that it's anything but inert, but these names will still pop up from time to time. Now, to highlight the main differences between these three pools, I'm going to show you a slide that looks a little bit complex, but I'll step you through it so that it's relatively easy to understand. On the left-hand side here, we have the graph represents changes in clay content. So down the bottom here, where we've got zero clay, we've really just got sands or silts. Up the top here, we've got 100% clay. Most of our soils are somewhere in this region here. Sandy loams will be somewhere around here, maybe 15%, 10, 15, 20% clay. Clay loams will be 25, getting up to 40% clay, and above 40% we're into light clays and heavier clays. So most of our soils are going to be in this area here. On the bottom axis here, we're showing some of the different soil properties that soil organic matter influences. Cation exchange capacity, which is the nutrient holding potential of a soil, soil structure, energy for biological processes, provision of nutrients, and soil thermal properties. So the different pools of soil organic matter, so the recalcitrant, the slowly turning over carbon, and the less slow turning over carbon, humus, these forms of organic matter contribute enormously to the nutrient holding potential of a soil, also the water holding potential of a soil. When we look at soil structure, we see that the particulate, the younger, the faster turning over carbon is contributing really significantly to soil structure, as is humus. When we look at energy for biological processes, we see that the particulate carbon has got a big role to play here. And that's because it's less protected in soils. It's more available for microbial consumption. And a small proportion of the humus is constantly turning over as well. In terms of provision of nutrients for plants, we have a small amount coming from the particulate matter, but the humus is the real reserve of nutrients for plants in soil. And thermal properties, it's really around humus and the recalcitrant carbon, because these are the very dark colored carbons that influence soil color, and soil color is directly influencing soil thermal properties. I'll kind of touch back on these points as we go through and talk about other properties. I really just want to make the point here that these pools are not fixed. They're constantly moving, and they need to constantly move. So as one pool is depleted, it gets topped up by fresh organic matter coming in. So this is the fresh stuff, the very labile material coming in that gets used up very quickly. A proportion of that material is going to go through the microbial biomass. So it's the bugs will eat this stuff. And then as the bugs die, and remember I was saying that microbial biomass is contributing hugely to soil organic matter, this is going down into the slow moving pool, the humus pool. And as this material gradually gives up its nutrient load through microbial degradation, it again enters this part of the cycle where it becomes available for plant uptake. Some of the carbon from all of these pools, as it's consumed by soil microbes, is released as CO2 to the atmosphere. And when we burn with either burning stubble or grass fires or forest fires, that's when the recalcitrant carbon component is a product of fire. It's a form of charcoal, and that's when it gets laid down. So the really important point here is this is moving all the time, and it must move. And if it doesn't move, we have serious problems. We have a constipated system that is really where the soil is going to be hard, nutrients aren't cycling, plant growth is going to struggle. So when we have high microbiological and macrobiological populations, they're the things that are driving this cycle. And that's when nutrients are being released for plants to grow, more material is being coming in and being processed. So think of this as a factory with goods in, goods out, cycling through. The busier it is, the faster it is, the more efficient it is, the better that factory is going to work. And I often use the analogy of the old analog watch, where we have wheels spinning at different speeds, and we need them all to move at the same time at their own speeds for the watch to work as a whole. And so it is with the carbon cycle. If all of these wheels spin at the speed that they're supposed to spin at, we have a perfectly functioning system. Now, let me talk for a minute about what influences carbon capture, because there's a lot going on here. Firstly, climate is probably the biggest influence. And we've got this fancy word called humification. And really all that means is the process of humus development in soils. And it works best in cool, damp locations, and it works least well in warm, dry locations, which is why, you know, in Australia, the highest organic matter, organic carbon soils in the country are pretty much found in the Otways and in the Tasmanian highlands. And the lowest levels of organic matter will be found in the dry interior. So where we have moisture, where we have cool conditions, we have retention and building up of soil organic matter in the humus pool, and we have the opposite effect, the opposite happening in warm and dry locations. And the second biggest influence on carbon capture is management practices. And soil disturbance, whether we're tilling or trying to reduce that tillage, soil disturbance really accelerates carbon loss. And one of the main reasons for that, of course, is its influence on the carbon cycle. It basically brings organic matter into more intimate contact with soil microbes and temporarily promotes soil microbial populations, but they quickly exhaust the available carbon. And the third point, of course, is the quantity of carbon going into the system. So once upon a time, we are, the sustainability and the fertility of our systems was driven by green manure and the return of other forms of organic matter, brown manures, etc., going back into the system. With the advent of the Green Revolution and the development of powerful fertilizers, we said, well, these grow crops, fast and well. We don't need to worry about putting manures, etc., back into the system. And that, of course, has created a considerable drawdown in soil organic matter. And the third thing that strongly influences soil organic matter levels in soil is the soil type, soil texture, the proportion of sand versus clay in the soil. And as you saw in that slightly complicated diagram that I showed you previously, the cation exchange capacity is largely made up of the humus and recalcitrant carbon components, and basically the more clay there is in a system to a point, the more organic matter it's capable of holding. And finally, time. Time is everything here, because organic matter builds up slowly, usually more slowly than we're able to deplete it. So it requires real commitment and resolute effort to make sure that there is enough organic matter going in every year to continue the build up, the sequestration of carbon in our soils. So other influences on carbon capture are soil pH, so the chemical environment. Drainage has a big influence on carbon capture, which refers to the chemical and physical environment. Soil structure has a big role in the capture of carbon also, and things like salinity and overgrazing, and again, the volume of organic inputs. I'm just going to touch briefly now on each of these points and just mention why they influence carbon capture. You'll all be familiar with the diagram, the graphic on the left, which shows, with as we move away from a neutral or slightly acid pH, where we have optimum availability of all macro and micro elements, the availability of different elements becomes constrained in strongly acid or strongly alkaline soils. But interestingly, the cation exchange capacity, as is shown here, and I mentioned before how significant the cation exchange capacity of organic matter is, and this is just looking at cation exchange capacity of the different types of organic matter. So green is the recalcitrant, the very, very slowly turning over material. The humus is also the slow pool, and the particulate organic matter is the labile carbon, the faster turning over pool. The soil pH has a significant influence on the cation exchange capacity, on how much nutrient these different forms of organic matter can hold. So yes, we can grow crops quite well down at 5.5, but as you can see, we're definitely not optimizing our system for production if we're trying to work at a pH of 5.5. If we were up here at a pH of high 6s or 7, you can see that we're doubling the cation exchange capacity of the benefit of cation exchange capacity from the different components of organic matter. Waterlogging, it's a bit of a no-brainer when we look at this slide here, that if all this soil here is waterlogged, it's going to be biologically drowned. So we're not going to be getting carbon sequestration because we're not getting roots or anything growing in here, and we're not getting microbes living in here. So we want our soils to be well drained so that these roots can grow to depth, we can have microbiological activity to depth, and we have soil carbon sequestration to depth. And when we're talking about optimizing physical condition for soil carbon sequestration, we're talking about the impact of tillage on structure, waterlogging, and compaction. And I have to use these analogies of, the flooding or catastrophes such as earthquakes, and you see what it does to human habitation. So if you imagine this is a pore network in the soil, and this is where soil organisms used to live, well, the tractor has just gone through this part of the paddock, they're all crushed. That soil is not going to be functioning particularly well at all. Now, why this is so important for yield is a well-structured soil high in organic matter has got more air, has got better drainage, has got better opportunities for root expansion, has got better opportunities for microbial population enhancement. And this is some work that was done by colleagues in Tasmania a number of years ago that looked at the percentage of crop yield and that was aligned with the structure score of the soil. So this was a visual assessment that said, okay, this soil here is compacted and cloddy with a score of 4 or 5. This soil over here is beautifully friable. It's been well looked after. There's been lots of fresh inputs of organic matter at 10. And with the same level of inputs, look at what the yields that are. So over here, where somebody is achieving, 50% of the potential yield from that soil and from those inputs, and the farmer over here is achieving, 90+% of potential yield. So this is what's on offer here: substantial increases in yield for the same level of input. And obviously, these farmers over here are profitable and forward-looking, whereas these farmers here are pretty stuck. Part of the reason why, if our soils are in poor condition, the efficiency of our nutrient use is significantly constrained. And this is some work that I did on a project when I was with the Victorian government, with Monash University, looking at compost use on dairy farms in southwestern Victoria. And this component of the work looked at nutrient use efficiency between a group of farms that were conventional. These are all conventional farms, but a group of them were using composts and a group were just using no composts. Both were using fertilizer. This group was using less chemical fertilizer because they were allowing for the nutrients that were coming through in compost. And as you can see, there was considerable variation between the two groups. But if we just look at nitrogen for time's sake, we'll see that this compost farmer really did not have very good nutrient use efficiency. He wasn't, even though he's using compost, there was obviously stuff that he wasn't doing right. With 20% nitrogen use efficiency, that's pretty poor. 80% of his nitrogen was not contributing to production. Whereas on this farm here, 44.5% of the nitrogen was contributing to production. Now, nitrogen is a hugely volatile element, so it's trying to escape the system all the time. So a value like this is really quite good. But this also explains why nitrogen is quite a polluting element. What this table shows is that looking at just nitrogen use efficiency, 3 of the best were compost users. 1 of the conventionals had very good nitrogen use efficiency, and this one here was equal best as well. So there was overall, when we looked at the scores across the 4 essential elements here, we had overall improved nutrient use efficiency when compost was used in conjunction with conventional fertilizers. And this is to do with the contribution that the composts were making to the structure of the soil. And when we're talking about soil structure, we're talking about the friability of soil. Now, this is a clay soil under an orchard in near Druin, and you can see my spade has smeared the side of the hole a bit. But you can see the soil is generally friable, high surface area with good moisture penetration. These photographs were taken from the row directly opposite, which were the control rows, showing business as usual under orchards, sprayed out under vine, and with the same irrigation practice, the same everything else. Look at the cracking in this soil. And this is where the irrigation was dropping from the elevated irrigation line here. You can just see the small area in which water was penetrating into this profile. The soil here was dry and here was dry, and it was miserable by comparison. This was a little serendipitous discovery. I was running a trial up near Stanhope on a cropping farm, and I was looking at the crop, and then I realized just outside of the cropping area there was some stubble from last year. Now, these are difficult soils. They're light clays, they're sodic, they're dispersive, and as you can see, what happens with these soils is just under the influence of rainfall, the surfaces seal up. What I noticed here was where the line of stubble was from the previous year, we had this fine aggregation happening at the surface. And this is as this stubble is breaking down and releasing its carbon into the microbial pool, they are working the soil surface And we can see when we look just a little bit more closely, we have sealed surface here. Where there's organic matter, we have this lumpy, porous surface where we're going to get infiltration. Here, we're going to get runoff. Okay, now we need to move on. I've really got a little over 5 minutes left and haven't covered everything I want to say. So I'm going to have to skip over some of the things, but it'll give you an idea of some of what we want to cover. So we can optimize biological condition for soil carbon sequestration through our management practices. And none of this is rocket science. This is what we have talked about for years, avoiding compaction, avoiding waterlogging, trying to minimize the use of deleterious sprays, etc. I won't talk too much about the use of compost today, but there's suffice to say that there's a lot of confusion about, well, is compost a fertilizer or a soil conditioner? And I can't tell you how many farmers I've spoken to that said, oh, I tried compost, it didn't do anything, so I stopped using it. Compost is primarily a soil conditioner. Like with the example of nutrient use efficiency that I showed you on the dairy farms, the contribution from compost is really about increasing soil organic matter and all the benefits to soil structure and the soil environment that brings about. Yes, there's nutrient availability from compost, but that comes later. The first thing that we want to see from compost is an improvement, a gradual improvement in nutrient use efficiency. I developed a calculator a few years ago to look at how much we can reduce fertilizers by when we're using when we're applying compost at a particular level, but I won't dwell on that now. It's important to show that, and this is a graph taken from a Rothamsted experiment that's been going since 1852. And what it's really showing is that soil carbon changes take place over long periods of time. Soil carbon storage capacity is finite for a particular soil, and the largest changes happen early on in the piece. But when we stop applying, when we stop putting organic matter into that soil, we see the system, we see the levels starting to drop again, and they drop quite quickly, as we have talked about. Similarly, if we want to convert a cropping, if we want to crop a pasture system, we'll see a sudden drop in soil carbon, and that decline continues over a number of years, as is shown here. And then when we convert that cropping land back to permanent pasture, we'll get a bounce back as the soil carbon begins to increase. But you can see that most of the bounce back in the early years comes from the labile carbon pool, and it takes longer for the humus to recover. But what it's showing is that once we're on this trajectory, we've just got to keep going, and we've got to add year on year, because it takes time. The real benefit, and this is a bit of a psychedelic graph, but what this is showing is that if we're applying composts or manures, the nitrogen, for example, that gets released out of these, because nitrogen is a highly desirable element in nature, lots of organisms have evolved mechanisms to compete, and compete very strongly and quickly for it. So what that means is when some nitrogen becomes available to the system, the soil microbes grab it first and immobilize it in their bodies. And so plants only get maybe 10% of it in year one. But if we're applying organic matter, compost, year on year on year, that 10% that's available in year one is 4% in year two, and is maybe 2% of that in every subsequent year. But you can see it gradually builds up to a point where the nitrogen availability is sufficient to meet the system's needs. And this is why conversion to a regenerative agriculture system is a gradual process, and the benefits take time to accrue. But when they accrue, they deliver a system that has such deep resilience that that it's going to cope with the perturbations that we experience by way of flood and drought and heat and cold so much better than a soil with depleted organic matter. these are a whole bunch of examples of work that I've done where we've increased organic matter under horticulture. In agriculture, this is a trial that that I did here up in the irrigation district in northern Victoria, and we applied. This is a yield map. Green is good, red is bad. We applied compost subsurface to this part of the paddock here, and this was the yield change after in the following season. And out of that, we have proceeded now, and we're extending this practice across the whole farm. I recently completed a large project on compost under vines to show, huge savings in water in particular, and vine quality with when the surface of the soil is covered. This is some work from New South Wales that showed the role of composts on controlling disease-causing nematodes. Did a similar trial up in the Goulburn-Broken region under apples. Lots of examples under dairy, and lots of examples coming through now with cover cropping. And this is from a farmer out at Druin, and he's a dairy farmer growing these big cover crops, introducing diverse root architectures, working down deep into the soil, so bringing the soil to life to depth. And this is an example of how he's grazing it, strip grazing, taking most of that top cover off and then allowing a proportional dieback in plant roots to feed the soil. So to quickly summarize, managing soil carbon is critical to adaptation, resilience, and sustainability. You can grow it or buy it. Massive benefits to water and nutrient holding, massive benefits to soil structure and deep rooting, huge improvement in plant resilience and reliability of yields. It controls disease outbreaks in soils, either completely or greatly reduces the severity of them, and most critically, it feeds the soil. So I'll pull up here and see if we've got any questions.
Thank you very much, Declan, for that. As always, such a wide terrain of material that's been covered. To people on the webinar, just to highlight that the slides are available, so they'll be sent out, or certainly contact us at team@agriprove.io, because there were some great materials there, Declan, in terms of some of those case studies on the projects that you're working on that I think would be of interest. Again, some key things that stood out there was that some great conceptualizations. Soil as a three-legged stool, so it's the physical, the biological, and the chemical, and organic matter as central. That nutrient holding potential of soil. So what was it? Sand with a cationic exchange capacity of 9. Was it clay at about 25? Was that right? And organic matter at 400. So just like showing that potential again. Organic matter is food for biology, but it's a story beyond carbon. Is about water and nutrient availability. But probably the thing that's really stuck out to me, Declan, was that figure on the contribution of soil microbial detritus. And was that nearly 2/3 contribution?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that is such a stunning wake-up call. And that paper that I've cited there is from 2020. So a lot of this research is really comparatively recent, because now we have the tools to be able to tease open the soil organic matter and see, well, where did it actually come from? And we're discovering compounds like chitin in there. And think, well, plants don't make chitin. Where did that come from? Well, that's coming from soil fungi. And again, we keep coming, soil fungi is constantly keeps creeping back into the frame, whether we like it or not, as a really important component of the soil ecosystem.
So again, just like seeing just that's a wealth of opportunity in terms of understanding that biology. So I'm really looking forward to next week's webinar soil biology, and also Declan, just some of those conceptualizations in terms of and making that link to modern infrastructure about the impact of waterlogging and flooding and the impact of compaction on human infrastructure in terms of earthquakes, and just sort of like bring that down to the soil story, and what a great graph too in terms of your nitrogen as a rainbow, charting the pathway on the regenerative journey. We've got do have some questions, so I'm just going to run them at you, but maybe just a quick one, just a terminology, mineralization of carbon. Could you just say what mineralization?
So mineralization of organic matter, I probably should have said if I said mineralization of carbon, but there I go interchanging those two terms, which I shouldn't do. Basically, it's the release of the mineral component of the organic matter. So it's in my work, I test a lot of composts in the lab. And the Australian standard requires compost to have a minimum of 20% soil carbon. So that means a minimum of 35% organic matter. And so often people say, 35% organic matter, isn't compost all organic matter? Well, the example I give is if you take a log, which you think is all organic matter, you burn it on the fire, there's a whole lot of ash left. That ash is made up of calcium, magnesium, potassium, so that what I call the ash elements, they're the mineral elements. The nitrogen goes off in the flame, and sulfur is lost that way as well. But when that's in the soil, those mineral elements get released out of the organic matter and become available for soil microbes and plants to use.
Declan, you talked a lot in this webinar about the importance of structure, and then I guess the question is, in increasing organic matter, does that actually improve soil structure and nutrient efficiency? And then maybe just as a follow-on to the comments on compost, is the use of compost in soil structure. So, and the gains from compost, is it improved nutrient efficiency, or is it the actual nutrients in the compost?
It's all of those things, Matthew. The first thing that we look for from compost really is a change in the environment of the soil. And we get the change in the environment of the soil because basically we're bringing in food for the population that's working in the soil to try and sustain their environment. So remember, this is a huge underground system. So imagine the biggest, underground mine in the world that you can imagine. So if we were to discover lots more gold there, we would bring in all these extra resources to make the mine bigger so we could get at the gold. So when we introduce compost, we're feeding the soil organisms, those populations breed up and they start fixing up the mess that we created with our compactive practices, and they start rebuilding soil structure. When we have a rebuilt soil structure and we have a soil that's breathing and draining, that's where the nutrients going into there are captured quickly by the clay or by the soil organic matter and held in a form that's available to plants. So our nutrient use efficiency is greatly improved. If we apply nitrogen to a soil that's waterlogged, most of that nitrogen is going to convert to a gas and will be lost either as very damaging nitrous oxide or as plain old N2. I've lost your.
I was on mute. Declan, does the same logic apply to nutrients that are already locked up in the soil profile? Like you're improving health, improving structure, improving cation exchange capacity. Does that actually unlock nutrients that are bound up in the existing profile? So that sort of nutrient store.
What we're doing when we're increasing soil organic matter, we're increasing the efficiency of the entire factory. So what that means is we've got more workers. The more workers down in the mine. They're clearing out a collapsed part of the mine. They're putting the shutters back up, and they're able to get back into that part of the mine that had previously collapsed. And that's where there's some of the gold. the gold in the form of phosphorus, the gold in the form of nitrogen, in the form of whatever else. And so they're now able to access it where previously they weren't. And because the populations are bigger, there's more specialist phosphorus solubilizers in that workforce as well. So it's about improving the entire efficiency. And this, when we're talking about soil improvement in a regenerative agricultural system, we're talking about optimizing soil function. And the soil function is all of the things that I'm talking about, getting high populations of workers in there, getting the soil to breathe, getting the soil to drain, improving access to some of these locked up and hidden elements.
Great. A few more questions on related to compost. So compost aren't created equal. So how do you have any views on how to assess what kind of compost is right for what kind of particular soil or management system?
Look, I do, and there's a lot to be said on that, and probably much more than I'm able to say now.
An 8-part webinar series.
That's Appendix A, yeah. But suffice to say that what goes into the compost obviously influences strongly compost quality. The way the compost is managed while it's composting, so we need to have optimal air and water in that compost, and we usually achieve that by turning the compost. And then the amount of time that's left. So all composting is, it's like a time-lapse photography of what happens to compost, to organic matter in the soil. So it might take, in the soil, it might take 5 years, example, for X amount of humus to form, but it might, the same amount of humus might form in a well-managed compost pile over a 16-week period. So the quality of material that goes in, the way it's managed, the amount of time that it's allowed influences the quality of compost and the stability of that compost, and that influences as well then what the purpose of the compost is for as well.
And a follow-on on the use of compost, just whether you had any comments in terms of incorporation of compost into soils in permanent plantings under natural rainfall versus under tree sprinklers or under drip irrigation.
Yeah, look, I've been to many investigations where in orchards, for example, where the drip line is placed on the surface of the soil and there's compost and whatever else placed above that. If there's very little rainfall and that compost and mulch remains dry most of the time, great from a weed control point of view, because it's just not going to break down. So it's not going to get into the soil. It needs moisture to fall on it to make it wet, to stimulate biological activity, to make it break down, to make it go into the soil. Now, ideally with compost, you want to turn it into the soil if you can, and which is fine in an annual system. But in a perennial system, you don't want to be disturbing the soil. So in a grazing system, for example, or under perennial horticulture, I would generally recommend, say, grazing the grass down or cutting it down between in the pasture or under the trees, pretty low, applying your compost, and then letting the pasture grow up through the compost, thereby providing a microclimate at the surface of the soil to assist that compost to break down. The microclimate will be elevated humidity and increased biological activity at the soil surface.
And just a quick bookend on the compost, harking back to the last webinar, just on the practicalities as to how is actually compost spread onto farms or incorporated, particularly into grazing systems.
That was seen as a major impediment for a long time, which is why most larger farmers in particular just didn't even consider it. But I'm working with large corporates in the north of the state. And what we're doing, we're taking compost from Melbourne. We're using backloading, so the transport is very cheap. The loads are large, and we're using appropriate equipment to spread it. So big belt spreaders. So this can be handled like any other large bulk product. You absolutely have to be set up for it. But we've done the maths on it, and it is entirely affordable on broadacre. And we're seeing more and more of that happening on broadacre now. So it does require a bit of investigation. It does require a bit of shopping around to get those lower back loading rates, but it's entirely feasible.
Great. We're approaching the top of the hour. Just a couple of questions to round out this webinar, Declan. You talked about management as having an impact on levels of soil organic carbon and as a risk. So what do you think the biggest risk are, the biggest management activities are to a risk of soil organic carbon or increasing soil organic carbon?
Well, probably the biggest risks are, and I'm going to talk, I think, next week about
biology.
I think, yes, but I'm going to introduce some of the concepts of regenerative agriculture. And some of the key principles of regenerative agriculture starts with keeping soil covered, minimizing disturbance, maximizing diversity in the system, trying to have living roots year round, and introducing livestock. So that's not exactly in order, but certainly keeping the ground covered at all times is critically important, because usually we're going to keep it covered with organic matter. And if we got organic matter there year round, and particularly if we've got something growing year round, we've got organic matter going into the system all the time. Then we avoid disturbance, as we talked about last week, you know, the huge difference in soil invertebrate populations between a perennial undisturbed system, the pastures, compared to the conventional potato population. You know, it was you know, a tenth, less than a tenth of the population in the disturbed soil. So if we want to sequester carbon, we've got to work with the creatures that will sequester it for us, which is the living component of the soil, which we'll talk about next week.
Right. And then one that was again today, we're talking about the importance of soil structure. So can you look at some sort of physical mechanisms in terms of improving soil structure, such as deep ripping? What are your thoughts there?
Look, deep ripping has its place, but I've seen an awful lot of deep ripping done because it kind of makes us feel good when we do it. We feel like we're really doing something, opening up the soil, only to realize that within 12 to 24 months, we're back at square one again. And we've probably done more damage. So actually, we're not back at square one, we're back at square one minus one in a couple of years' time. But if there is a need to deep rip, I always say, well, okay, you want to deep rip, what are you going to do next? And what that means is really, what are you going to do to ensure, what are you going to do differently to ensure that the disturbance that you've created with that deep ripping is going to be preserved? And usually what that will mean is you're going to have to grow bigger roots than you were growing before. You're going to have to put more organic matter into that system than you had previously put to sustain the benefit of the ripping, lest it fall back into a, you know, same minus one in 2 years' time.
So the importance of integration with all these things. You can't just look at it in isolation.
Exactly.
That's great, Declan. We're at the end of this webinar. There were a few questions which we will try and pick up next week that we didn't have time to get to today. This has been the webinar on organic matter, the cornerstone of soil health and sustainable production. Thanks to the AgriProve team, in particular Mel Adensall, for pulling all the technical details of the webinar together. Thanks to our presenter, Declan McDonald from Regen Soils. The next webinar, soil biology, millions of years in the making. So I'm really looking forward to that. And as always, if you do have any questions or comments on the webinar, things you'd like us to pick up on, feel free to email the team at AgriProve on team@agriprove.io. Thanks again.